Sometimes a man spends his whole life running from love, only to find it waiting on his own front porch. Sometimes it takes seeing someone else's tears to realize your own heart is still capable of breaking. In the frontier town of Mercy Ridge, Judah Boone was known as a driftera giant, of a man who never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home. After years of wandering, he returns to find Willa May, a widow with nowhere left to turn, crying on the steps of his old family homestead. She's fighting to save her orphaned niece from men who deal in debts and desperation. When Judah sees her there broken but unbroken, defeated but still defiant, something shifts inside his weathered heart. In a voice barely above a whisper, he speaks words that surprise them both. Words about forever, in a world built on temporary. What happens when a man who's made peace with loneliness suddenly can't imagine living without someone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never settled in Mercy Ridge. It hung in the air like unfinished business, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that spoke to the hard-scrabble nature of life on the frontier. The town squatted between rolling hills and endless prairie, a collection of weathered buildings that had seen too many storms and not enough mercy. Main Street stretched like a scar through the heart of it all, lined with establishments that served the basic needs of survival: a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and Doc Harrison's clinic, where more men left horizontal than vertical. Judah Boone had been born in this place 38 years ago, but he'd spent the last 15 trying to forget it existed. He was a man carved from granite and circumstance, standing 6'4" in his worn boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry more than his share of trouble. His hands were scarred from 1,000 fights and twice as many regrets, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much of what men do to each other when they think nobody's watching. Those who remembered him from before said he'd been different once, quicker to smile, slower to anger. But that was before the war, before the things he'd done in service to a cause that felt increasingly hollow with each passing year. Before he'd learned that sometimes the only way to sleep at night was to keep moving, to never stay in one place long enough for the ghosts to catch up. He'd built a reputation across 3 territories as a man you could hire when the situation was beyond reason or law. Not a killer for hire. Judah had lines he wouldn't cross, but someone who could end problems that couldn't be solved with words or writs. He was the man ranchers called when rustlers got too bold, the one sheriffs telegraphed when outlaws made their towns into playgrounds. He'd take the job, see it through with the quiet efficiency of long practice, collect his pay, and disappear like smoke on the wind. But something had been gnawing at him lately, a restlessness that wasn't cured by movement, a hunger that wasn't satisfied by purpose. He'd found himself thinking about the old homestead more often, wondering if the apple trees his mother had planted were still bearing fruit, if the porch swing his father had built still creaked in the evening breeze. So when the last job ended, a claimed jumper problem down in Colorado that he'd resolved with more talking than shooting, he'd pointed his horse north and come home. The homestead sat 2 miles outside town, nestled in a shallow valley where Willow Creek meandered through cottonwoods before emptying into the broader Mercy River. His grandfather had chosen the spot well close enough to town for trade and community, far enough away to avoid most of the noise and politics. The house itself was solid timber construction, built to last through prairie winters and summer storms, with a wide front porch that faced east to catch the morning sun. But as Judah crested the hill that gave the first clear view of his childhood home, he could see that 15 years of abandonment had taken their toll. The roof sagged in places, shingles missing like broken teeth. The barn looked sound enough, but the corral fence had gaps where posts had rotted through. Weeds grew tall in what had once been his mother's vegetable garden, and the apple trees drooped under the weight of unpruned branches. What stopped him cold, though, was the woman sitting on his front steps. She was hunched forward, elbows on her knees, face buried in her hands, in the universal posture of defeat. Her dark hair had escaped its pins and hung around her shoulders like a curtain, and her dress, once fine, but now showing the wear of hard times, was dusty from travel. A small canvas bag sat beside her, containing what appeared to be everything she owned in the world. Judah sat his horse at the edge of the yard, uncertain. In all his wandering years, he'd developed an instinct for reading situations quickly, who was dangerous, who was desperate, who was worth his time. This woman radiated a particular kind of exhaustion that came from fighting battles you couldn't win with weapons you didn't have. The sound of his horse's hooves on the packed earth made her look up, and Judah felt something shift in his chest. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes blazed with the kind of fierce intelligence that could make a man forget his own name. She was perhaps 30, with the kind of beauty that survived hardship by transforming into something deeper and more lasting than mere prettiness. There was steel in the set of her jaw, defiance in the straightness of her spine, even in defeat. "You lost, mister?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight tremor that she was clearly fighting to control. Judah swung down from his saddle, his spurs chiming softly against the stirrups. "Could ask you the same thing, ma'am, though it appears you found what you were looking for." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dust on her cheeks. "I'm Willa Mae Garrett. I have papers for this place." She gestured toward the house with something between pride and desperation. "Bought it fair and square from the territorial office." "That's so." Judah kept his voice neutral, but his mind was racing. The territorial office had no right to sell his family's land. His father had held clear title, passed down through proper probate when he died. "Might I see those papers?" Willa Mae reached into her bag and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age and official stamps. Judah took it carefully, noting how her hands trembled slightly as she released it. The deed was elaborate with territorial seals and signatures, claiming to transfer ownership of the Boone homestead to one Wilhelm Garrett for the sum of $50 and other valuable considerations. "Your husband?" Judah asked, handing the paper back. "Was." Her voice caught slightly on the word. "Wilhelm died last spring. Fever took him quick." She refolded the deed with practiced precision, as if she'd shown it many times before. "Left me with this place and his debts. More of the latter than the former, as it turns out." Judah studied her face, seeing the story written in the lines around her eyes, the careful way she held herself upright, despite everything trying to knock her down. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Garrett, but I'm afraid there's been some confusion. This is my family's land, has been for 30 years. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, Judah thought she might faint. Instead, she clutched the deed to her chest like a shield. No, that can't be right. Wilhelm paid good money for this place. We have papers." "Papers can be forged, ma'am, especially when there's profit in it." Judah's voice gentled, seeing how close she was to breaking. "Tell me about these debts your husband left." Willa Mae's shoulders sagged as if the weight of her troubles had suddenly doubled. Wilhelm was a gambling man. Thought he was smarter than he was. When he died, turned out he owed money to some very unforgiving people. They came calling 2 months after the funeral, said they'd take payment in flesh if they couldn't get it in cash. "What kind of flesh?" Judah asked, though he suspected he already knew. "My niece, Emma. She's only 8 years old, but they don't care about that." Tears started flowing again, and this time Willa Mae didn't try to stop them. "They said Wilhelm put her up as collateral in a card game, said if I couldn't pay his debts, they'd take her to work them off." The cold fury that had been Judah's constant companion during the war years stirred in his chest. Men who would use children to settle gambling debts were the worst kind of vermin, lower than the scavengers that picked at roadkill. "Where's the girl now?" "Hidden? Safe, I hope." Willa Mae looked up at him with desperate eyes. "I sold everything I could, came here thinking this place might be worth something, thinking maybe I could sell it, pay them off, get Emma back. But if the deed's no good—" She broke off, unable to finish the thought. Judah could see her whole world crumbling behind her eyes, the last fragile hope she'd been clinging to turning to dust in her hands. The smart thing would be to send her on her way, point her toward the territorial office, let her fight it out with the bureaucrats who'd sold her stolen goods. Judah had his own problem squatter's rights to establish, a homestead to rebuild, a life to figure out. He'd spent 15 years learning not to get involved in other people's troubles. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, watching this woman try to hold herself together with nothing but stubborn pride and desperate love for a child in danger, Judah felt something he'd thought was dead stirring back to life. Maybe it was the way the setting sun turned her tears to gold. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother, who'd sat on these same steps waiting for his father to come home from his own dangerous work. Maybe it was just the bone-deep loneliness he'd been carrying for so long that he'd forgotten it had a cure. Whatever it was, it made him do something he hadn't done in 15 years of careful, calculated living. It made him decide to stay. "Mrs. Garrett," he said, his voice soft as a prayer, "when I saw you crying on my stairs, I knew I'm going to marry you." The words hung in the air between them like a promise neither of them had been expecting. Willa May stared at him with wide eyes, her tears stopping from sheer shock. Judah felt as surprised as she looked. The words had come from some deep place he'd forgotten existed, carrying a truth that felt as solid as the ground beneath their feet. "I beg your pardon," she whispered. "I know it sounds crazy. I know we just met. But there's something about you, something about this moment that feels like destiny arriving right on time." Judah stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "You need help, and I need a reason to stop running. Maybe we can help each other figure out what comes next." Willa May searched his face as if looking for the trick, the angle, the reason a stranger would make such an impossible offer. "You don't even know me. I know you're brave enough to face down men who traffic in children. I know you love that little girl enough to risk everything for her. I know you've got backbone enough to keep fighting when most people would have given up." Judah's voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts about character. "That's enough to build on." The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was singing its evening song. Willa May sat perfectly still for a long moment, weighing impossible choices in her mind. Finally, she spoke. "You really think you can help me get Emma back? I think we can help each other do whatever needs doing." She nodded slowly, as if making a decision that would change everything. "All right, Judah Boone, all right." 3 days of tentative peace settled over the homestead like morning mist, fragile and temporary. Judah had spent the time assessing what needed fixing, while Willa May worked to make the inside of the house habitable again. They moved around each other with careful politeness, two wounded souls learning to share the same space without stepping on old hurts. Willa May proved to be a woman of remarkable capability. She'd scrubbed years of dust and neglect from the kitchen, patched holes in curtains with scraps from her own petticoats, and somehow coaxed the old cookstove back to life with the same gentle persistence she seemed to apply to everything. Judah found himself pausing in his work just to watch her the way she hummed softly while she cleaned, the unconscious grace with which she moved through rooms that had been empty for too long. But beneath the domestic calm, tension hummed like a bowstring. Willa May jumped at every unexpected sound, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as if expecting riders to appear at any moment. She spoke of Emma in present tense, but wouldn't say where the child was hidden, and Judah respected her caution, even as it reminded him daily that their situation was far from resolved. The peace shattered on a Tuesday morning when the sound of hoofbeats broke the prairie silence. Judah was repairing the corral fence when he saw them 3 riders cresting the hill from town, moving with the lazy confidence of men who'd never met serious opposition. He recognized the type immediately: professional trouble, the kind of men who solved problems with violence and asked questions later. They rode expensive horses and wore their guns low and easy, advertising their trade to anyone with eyes to see. "Willa May," he called softly toward the house, not taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "We've got company." She appeared in the doorway, dish towel still in her hands, and the color drained from her face when she saw them. "Oh God," They found me. The riders pulled up in the yard with theatrical precision, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground. The leader was a thin man, with pale eyes and a smile that never reached them. His companions looked like they'd been carved from the same piece of hard, wood-weathered, dangerous, and utterly without conscience. "Morning, folks," the leader said, touching the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Name's Caleb Nash. These are my associates, Mr. Primes, G. Mines, Knott, Porter, and Mr. Stone." He gestured to his companions with casual indifference. "We're looking for a woman named Willa May Garrett. Been told she might be in these parts." Judah set down his hammer and straightened slowly, keeping his hands visible but ready. "Depends on who's asking and why they want to know." Nash's smile widened, showing teeth like yellowed ivory. "Why, we're collection agents, you might say. Mrs. Garrett's late husband incurred some debts, and we're here to discuss repayment options." His pale eyes fixed on Willa May, with the intensity of a snake studying a mouse. "Hello there, darling. You've led us quite a chase." Willa May stepped fully onto the porch, her chin raised in defiance, despite the tremor in her voice. "I don't owe you anything. Wilhelm's debts died with him." "Now see, that's where you're wrong." Nash reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. "Got his marker right here. Signed and witnessed proper. Says here that one Wilhelm Garrett wagered his niece Emma Catherine Garrett, age 8, against a debt of $500. When he couldn't cover the bet, well, the girl became collateral." Judah felt ice form in his veins. "Let me see that paper." Nash held it up but didn't offer to pass it over. "Afraid that's private business between Mrs. Garrett and my employer. But the terms are simple enough. The woman pays the $500, or we collect the girl. Either way, the debt gets settled." "You can't collect a child like she's a prize heifer," Willa May said, her voice rising with desperate anger. "Emma's not property. According to this here legal document, she is." Nash refolded the paper with deliberate slowness. "Now, we've been patient. Gave you time to come up with the money. But patience has its limits, and frankly, the girl's probably worth more to us than $500 anyway. Pretty little thing from what we hear. Lots of folks looking for young workers these days." The casual way he spoke about selling a child into slavery made Judah's vision blur red around the edges. He'd seen men like Nash during the war, the kind who profited from human misery and called it business. They were parasites dressed up in human skin, and the world was always better when they stopped breathing. "The girl's not here," Judah said carefully, his voice carrying a warning that men with sense would heed. Nash laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Oh, we know that, friend, but Mrs. Garrett here knows where she is, and that's almost as good." He leaned forward in his saddle, directing his words at Willa May. "See, darling, we can do this easy or we can do it hard. You tell us where the girl is, we collect her peaceful-like, and everyone goes their separate ways. Or we can make things unpleasant for you and your friend here, until you decide to cooperate." "And if she doesn't know where the girl is?" Judah asked. "Then I guess we'll have to find other ways to make her useful." Nash's smile turned predatory. "Pretty woman like that, there's always a market. Not as lucrative as a young girl, mind you, but business is business." That was enough. Judah took a step forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip, where his gun would normally hang. But he'd left his weapon inside, a mistake born of 3 days of deceptive peace. Nash noticed the gesture, and his smile widened. Now, friend, no need for unpleasantness. We're civilized men here." He nodded to his companions, who casually shifted their horses to better angles, hands drifting toward their weapons. "Tell you what, we'll give you folks 24 hours to think it over. Come sunrise tomorrow, we'll be back for an answer. And Mrs. Garrett?" His pale eyes fixed on her again. "I do hope you'll make the right choice. Hate to see such a pretty place get all shot up." The 3 men wheeled their horses around and rode back toward town at an unhurried pace, leaving Judah and Willa May standing in a yard that suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. The casual arrogance of their departure was almost worse than their threats. They were so confident in their superiority that they didn't even feel the need to watch their backs. Willa May sank onto the porch steps, her legs no longer able to support her. They found me. After all this time, they found me. Judah walked over and sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort without crowding her space. Where's Emma? Safe. Hidden with a family in Carson's Bluff, 2 counties north. They think she's a distant cousin, staying while her parents recover from illness. Willa May's voice was hollow with defeat. But it won't matter. If I don't give her up, they'll just keep coming. And if I do... She couldn't finish the sentence. They won't take her. The certainty in Judah's voice made Willa May look up at him. Those men are used to people who roll over and show their belly. They've never dealt with someone who fights back. You can't fight 3 armed men. They'll kill you. Maybe, but they'll have to earn it. Judah stood and offered her his hand. Come on, we've got work to do. What kind of work? The kind that ensures those men don't ride away from here tomorrow. Willa May stared at him for a long moment, seeing something in his eyes that spoke of capabilities she'd only guessed at. You've done this before. Too many times to count, but never for something that mattered as much as this. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. What do you need me to do? First, we need to get word to the family hiding Emma. Tell them to take her further away, at least until this is settled. Then we need to prepare for war. As they walked toward the house, Willa May felt something she hadn't experienced in months-shope. It was fragile and tentative, but it was real. For the first time since Wilhelm's death, she wasn't facing the monsters alone. Behind them, the crumpled bounty notice lay in the dust where Nash had dropped it, Emma's innocent face staring up at a sky that seemed suddenly darker than before. The first thing Judah did was retrieve his father's gun belt from the old wooden chest in the bedroom closet. The leather was still supple despite the years, and the Colt .45 nestled in its holster like it had been waiting for this moment. He strapped it around his waist with the automatic movements of long practice, feeling the familiar weight settle against his hip like an old friend returning home. Willa May watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. You wear it like you were born to it. Maybe I was. Judah checked the cylinder, counting bullets by feel. My father taught me that a gun is just a tool, no different from a hammer or a plow. It's the man behind it that makes it righteous or damned. And which are you? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the things they still didn't know about each other. Judah looked up from the weapon, meeting her gaze directly. I guess we'll find out. He spent the afternoon riding into town, ostensibly to buy supplies, but really to take the measure of the opposition. Mercy Ridge felt different now that he was looking at it through tactical eyes, not as a childhood memory, but as a battlefield. The saloon was too exposed, the sheriff's office too close to the main street, the general store positioned perfectly for watching comings and goings. Nash and his men had taken rooms at the hotel, making no effort to hide their presence. In fact, they seemed to be enjoying the attention their arrival had caused. Judah watched from across the street as they held court on the hotel porch, regaling anyone who'd listen with stories of their exploits. The townspeople gave them a wide berth, but Judah could see the fascination in their eyes, the same morbid curiosity that drew crowds to public hangings. Sheriff Rawlings was conspicuously absent from his office, and asking around revealed he'd suddenly developed urgent business in the county seat that would keep him away for several days. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and Judah filed that information away for later consideration. At the general store, he encountered Tom Fletcher, a man who'd been one of his father's closest friends in the old days. Fletcher was graying now, his back bent from years of manual labor, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. Judah Boone, Fletcher said, keeping his voice low. Heard you were back. Also heard you got yourself mixed up with some dangerous people. News travels fast. Bad news always does. Fletcher glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. Those men are poison, Judah, the kind that spreads until it kills everything decent in a place. Most folks are hoping they'll just take what they came for and move on. And what do you think they came for? Fletcher's expression hardened. I think they came for a little girl who never hurt nobody, and I think that's about as low as men can sink. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Your father was a good man, helped me out when I needed it, never asked for anything in return. If his son needs help now, well, maybe it's time to return the favor." It was the first offer of support Judah had received, and it warmed something cold in his chest. "I appreciate that, Tom, but this isn't your fight." "Like hell it isn't. A town that won't protect its children isn't worth calling home." Fletcher leaned closer. "What do you need?" "Information, mostly. How many more are there? Where are they getting their support? Who's paying their bills?" "Don't know about numbers, but I've seen telegrams going back and forth between here and Denver. Big city money, if I had to guess." "As for local support," Fletcher's mouth twisted with disgust, "there's some that figure cooperation is better than confrontation. Mayor Hutchins, for one. Some of the town council. They're all hoping if they just look the other way, the problem will solve itself. And if it doesn't, then we'll see what this town is really made of." That evening, Judah returned to the homestead with more questions than answers. He found Willa May in the kitchen, surrounded by the organized chaos of preparation. She'd cleaned his father's old rifle and laid out ammunition with military precision. Her own small pistola pearl-handled derringer that looked almost like a toy set beside a box of cartridges. "I sent word to the Hartmans," she said without looking up from her work. "They'll take Emma to her sister's place in Wyoming. Should be safe there until this is over." "Good. That's one less thing to worry about." Judah sat down across from her, noting the steady competence of her hands as she loaded cartridges. "You've done this before." Wilhelm wasn't the only one who knew how to handle trouble. Growing up on the frontier teaches you certain skills, whether you want to learn them or not. She looked up at him with tired eyes. "What did you find in town?" Judah told her about Nash's men, the absent sheriff, the divided loyalties of the townspeople. Willa May listened without interruption, her expression growing more grim with each detail. "So we're on our own," she said when he finished. "Mostly, but not entirely." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Tom Fletcher offered to help. There might be others." "Might be isn't much to build a plan on." "Then we build it on what we know for certain. 3 men, probably well-armed and experienced. They'll come here tomorrow, expecting us to fold like a bad poker hand. When we don't, they'll try intimidation first, then violence." Willa May turned her hand palm up, intertwining their fingers. "You could still leave. Take me with you if you want, but you don't owe me anything. This isn't your debt to pay." "Yes, it is." The certainty in his voice surprised them both. "The moment I decided to stay, the moment I made that promise on the porch, it became my debt, my fight, my family to protect." The word family hung in the air between them, fragile and new but carrying the weight of absolute truth. Somewhere in the past 3 days, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, they'd stopped being strangers helping each other and become something more. Not lovers not yet, but partners in a way that transcended mere convenience. "I've been thinking about what you said," Willa May said quietly. "About marrying me." Judah felt his heartbeat quicken. And I think maybe you're crazy, but I also think maybe crazy is exactly what this situation calls for." She met his eyes directly. "If we survive tomorrow, if we get Emma back safe, if we can build something real out of all this chaos, then yes, I'll marry you, Judah Boone." The promise settled over them like a benediction, transforming the simple kitchen into something sacred. Outside, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome song to the rising stars. But inside the house, for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither of them felt alone. They spent the rest of the evening preparing for battle with the methodical care of soldiers who'd learned that survival often depended on attention to detail. Windows were barricaded with furniture, leaving firing ports that provided good fields of view. Ammunition was distributed to strategic locations throughout the house. Escape routes were planned and rehearsed. As the night deepened, they sat together on the front porch, listening to the sounds of the prairie and drawing strength from each other's presence. Tomorrow would bring violence and possibly death, but tonight They had this, the quiet communion of two souls who'd found their match in the darkness. "Tell me about Emma," Judah said softly. Willa May smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached all the way to her eyes. "She's got Wilhelm's stubborn streak and her mother's quick wit. Loves to read anything she can get her hands on, even if half the words are too big for her. Makes up stories about the clouds, gives names to every stray cat that wanders by." Her voice grew thick with emotion. "She calls me Aunt Willa, but she's more like a daughter. The only family I have left in the world. She'll be safe," Judah promised. "Whatever it takes, however far we have to go, she'll be safe." Willa May leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I believe you. God help me, I believe you." They sat in comfortable silence until the moon rose full and bright, turning the prairie into a silver sea. Tomorrow would test everything they'd built in these brief days, their trust, their courage, their fragile hope for a future together. But tonight, they were home. The morning after Nash's first visit brought with it a deceptive calm that settled over the homestead like fog, hiding dangerous terrain. Judah woke to find Willa May already up, moving quietly through the kitchen, with the kind of purposeful energy that spoke of decisions made in the dark hours before dawn. She stood at the window, overlooking the front yard, still wearing her nightgown, but with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. In her hands was something that caught the early lighter, simple gold wedding ring that she turned over and over between her fingers like a worry stone. "Couldn't sleep?" Judah asked softly, not wanting to startle her. "Too much thinking." She didn't turn around, but her voice carried a weight of resolution that hadn't been there the night before. "I've been wearing this ring for 3 years, telling myself it meant something, that Wilhelm and I had built something real together." Judah moved to stand beside her, close enough to offer comfort, without crowding her space. "Maybe you did." "No." The word was quiet, but absolute. "We had convenience. We had necessity. We had two people trying to survive in a world that didn't much care whether we lived or died. But we didn't have love. Not the kind that makes you willing to stand and fight, instead of running away." She held up the ring, letting the morning light play across its worn surface. "Wilhelm put this on my finger because I needed protection, and he needed someone to cook his meals and mend his clothes. When he died, I kept wearing it because I thought it still meant something. But it doesn't. It never did." With deliberate care, Willa May set the ring on the windowsill, placing it gently but firmly aside, like a chapter of her life that had finally reached its proper ending. "And now?" Judah asked. "Now I know what real love feels like." She turned to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that took his breath away, not the desperate fear that had driven her to his doorstep, but a quiet strength that spoke of a woman who'd found something worth fighting for. "I know what it's like to want to build something that will last, to choose someone not because you have to, but because you can't imagine a future without them." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with truth and possibility. Judah felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of bonds he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten they were there. "Willa May, I love you," she said simply, the words falling between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. "I don't know how it happened so fast, but I do. And more than that, I trust you. With my life, with Emma's life, with the future I never thought I'd be brave enough to want." Judah reached for her then, his hands framing her face with the reverence of a man handling something precious beyond measure. "I love you too, more than I thought possible, more than I deserve." "We both deserve this," she said firmly. "We deserve happiness, we deserve safety, we deserve the chance to build something beautiful together." When they kissed, it was with the tender intensity of two souls recognizing their perfect match. Not the desperate passion of people facing death, but the deep certainty of those who'd found their home in each other's hearts. The sound of a horse approaching broke them apart, but neither moved far from the other. Through the window, they could see a single rider coming up the trail from town, not Nash or his men, but Tom Fletcher, riding fast with the urgency of someone carrying important news. Judah, Fletcher called as he pulled up in the yard. "We need to talk." They met him on the front porch, and Judah could see immediately that something had changed in the older man's demeanor. The uncertainty from yesterday was gone, replaced by the grim determination of someone who'd made peace with a difficult decision. "Nash came back to town last night," Fletcher began without preamble. "Brought more men with him, a lot more men. Professional killers by the look of them, not the usual frontier trash. Word is they're planning to hit the homestead today, in force." "How many?" Judah asked. "Dozen, maybe more. All armed, all looking like they know their business." Fletcher's weathered face was grave with the implications. "But that's not the only news I've got." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a piece of paper official-looking, with territorial seals and formal language that spoke of government authority. "This came in on the morning wire. It's a federal warrant for Nash's arrest, signed by a judge in Denver. Seems someone's finally taken notice of his activities." Judah scanned the document, noting the charges: kidnapping, extortion, conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. Serious crimes that carried serious penalties, if they could be enforced. "Problem is," Fletcher continued, "our sheriff's still conveniently absent, and Nash has enough men to fight off anything the territorial marshal might send. That warrant's not worth the paper it's printed on unless we can make it stick." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we make it stick ourselves." Fletcher's eyes held the steady resolve of a man who'd decided that some things were worth any risk. "I've been talking to folks in town, and we're tired of letting men like Nash run roughshod over decent people. There's 8 of us willing to stand with you when they come calling." Willa May stepped forward, her chin raised with the determination that Judah was learning to recognize as one of her defining characteristics. "9, she said quietly. "Ma'am, I appreciate the sentiment, but nothing." Her voice carried steel wrapped in velvet, the tone of a woman who'd made her choice and wouldn't be swayed from it. "This is my fight as much as anyone's. Emma's my responsibility. This is my home now, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take it away without a fight." Fletcher looked at Judah, who nodded slowly. "She's right. This is her fight, and she's proven she can handle herself." "All right then, 9 of us." Fletcher's expression grew more serious. "But we need to be smart about this. Nash has numbers and experience, but we have something he doesn't. Which is, we're fighting for our homes, our families, our future. He's fighting for money." Fletcher gestured toward the homestead, the garden, the life they'd begun to build together. "That makes all the difference in the world." They spent the morning preparing for battle with the methodical care of people who understood that survival often depended on attention to detail. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, positions were chosen and rehearsed, escape routes were planned and marked. But it was the quiet moments between the preparations that Judah would remember most clearly, Willa May humming softly as she prepared what might be their last meal together. The way the morning light caught her hair as she moved through the house, the simple domestic intimacy of 2 people building something worth defending. As noon approached, the townspeople began arriving at the homestead. Doc Harrison came first, his medical bag slung over one shoulder and an old army Colt on his hip. Jake Morrison followed, bringing his massive blacksmith strength and a shotgun that looked capable of stopping a charging buffalo. Martha Henley surprised everyone by appearing with her late husband's rifle and an expression that could have frozen hellfire. One by one, they took their positions around the property, creating a defensive perimeter that would make Nash's assault costly, even if it succeeded. These weren't professional soldiers, but they were people fighting for everything they held dear, and that made them more dangerous than any hired gun. "After this is over," Willa May said as they made their final preparations, "after we've dealt with Nash and his kind, I want to plant a real garden. Vegetables for eating, flowers for beauty, maybe even some fruit trees like your mother had. Planning for the future, planning for our future." She looked up at him with eyes that held no doubt, no reservation, only the quiet certainty of a woman who'd found her place in the world. "Because we're going to have one, Judah. We're going to have everything we've dreamed of and more." The confidence in her voice was infectious, and Judah found himself believing not just in their chances of surviving the day, but in the possibility of building something lasting from the ashes of everything they'd lost. The battle, when it came, was swift and decisive. Nash's men rode in expecting to face a lone gunman and a frightened woman, but instead found themselves caught in a crossfire from 9 determined defenders who knew every inch of the ground they were fighting on. The professional killers were competent, but they'd never faced opponents who fought not for pay but for principle. Doc Harrison's steady aim dropped 2 men before they could reach cover. Jake Morrison's shotgun cleared the barn area with devastating efficiency. Even Martha Henley proved deadly accurate with her husband's old rifle. Nash himself made it as far as the front porch before Willa May stepped into the doorway. No longer the frightened widow who'd wept on these same steps, but a woman transformed by love and the absolute refusal to lose another family to violence. She held Wilhelm's old shotgun with steady hands, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd found something worth dying for. "This ends here," she said simply. Nash's pale eyes widened with surprise at finding himself outmatched by someone he'd dismissed as prey. His hand moved toward his gun, but Willa May was faster. The heavy charge of buckshot lifted him off his feet and sent him tumbling backward into the yard, his long career of violence and intimidation finally over. With their leader dead and half their number fallen, Nash's surviving men chose discretion over valor, fleeing towards town at a gallop that left only dust and the lingering smell of gunpowder in their wake. In the sudden silence that followed, Willa May stood motionless in the doorway, the smoking shotgun still in her hands. On the windowsill behind her, her discarded wedding ring caught the afternoon light, no longer a symbol of the past, but a reminder of how far she'd traveled to reach this moment. "It's over," Judah said softly, taking the weapon from her trembling hands. "Is it really?" She looked up at him with eyes that held equal measures of relief and disbelief. "Are we really safe?" "We're really safe." He pulled her close, feeling the tension drain from her body as she finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of peace. "All of us, together." As the townspeople emerged from their defensive positions, checking on the wounded and securing the area, Emma appeared from her hiding place in the root cellar. Her young face was serious but unafraid, and she carried her wooden doll with the careful dignity of a child who'd learned that some things were precious precisely because they could be lost. "Is it really over, Uncle Judah?" she asked. "It's really over, sweetheart." He knelt to her level, seeing courage in her dark eyes that humbled him. "The bad men are gone, and they're not coming back. You're safe now." "We all are." Emma nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world, then surprised them both by walking to the windowsill and picking up Willa May's discarded wedding ring. She studied it for a moment with the serious concentration of childhood, then solemnly handed it to Judah. "I think Aunt Willa needs a new ring," she said with matter-of-fact wisdom. "One that means she's going to stay with us forever." Judah looked down at the simple gold band, then at the woman who'd taught him that love could triumph over fear, that standing still could require more courage than running, that some promises were worth keeping, even when keeping them might cost everything. "Yes," he said, slipping the ring into his pocket beside his mother's more elaborate band. "I think she does." The victory felt hollow by evening. As the townspeople dispersed back to their homes and businesses, the weight of what they'd started began to settle over the homestead like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Judah stood in the doorway of the old barn, staring at the place where Nash and his men had sat their horses just hours before, knowing with soldiers' certainty that this was only the beginning. Willa May found him there as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose. She carried a steaming cup of coffee in each hand, and the simple domestic gesture struck him as almost miraculous after the morning's violence. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, offering him one of the cups. "Thinking they'll be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And next time they won't underestimate us." Judah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. Nash isn't the type to let a public humiliation go unanswered. "So what do? We prepare." And we learn everything we can about who we're really fighting. That evening, Tom Fletcher arrived with more news. None of it good. He'd spent the afternoon asking discreet questions around town, piecing together what he could about Nash and his operation. "They're not working alone," Fletcher said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Got confirmation of what I suspected. There's big money backing them. Denver money, maybe even further east than that. The kind of people who see human beings as just another commodity to be bought and sold." Judah felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd encountered men like that during the war carpetbaggers and profiteers who followed armies like vultures, feeding on suffering and calling it business. How big an operation are we talking about? Big enough to have connections in the territorial government. Nash wasn't bluffing when he said they had pull with officials. Word is they've got judges in their pocket, marshals on their payroll, even some congressmen who turn a blind eye in exchange for campaign contributions. Willa May paled. "Then we can't win, if they have that kind of power." "Power's only useful if you're afraid of it," Judah said quietly. "And corruption has a weakness: it makes men careless. They rely on intimidation and influence instead of competence. When those tools fail, they don't know what to do." Fletcher nodded approvingly. "Your father would be proud of that thinking. He always said the hardest man to beat was the one who had nothing left to lose." That night, after Fletcher had gone home, Judah found himself drawn to the old wooden chest in the bedroom where he'd found his father's gun belt. Buried beneath faded photographs and yellowed letters was something he'd forgotten, existed by his mother's family. Bible, a massive leather-bound volume that had been passed down through 3 generations. The leather was cracked with age, and the gold lettering on the spine had faded to barely visible traces, but the pages inside were still pristine. Between the books of Matthew and Mark, pressed flat as the day they'd been placed there, were wildflowers from his mother's garden roses, and larkspur and baby's breath, preserved in eternal bloom. "She was beautiful," Willa May said softly from the doorway. Judah looked up to find her studying a daguerreotype that had fallen from the Bible's pages. The image showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding a baby that could only be Judah himself. "She died when I was 12, he said, taking the photograph from her gentle hands. "Fever took her in the space of 3 days. One morning she was making breakfast and humming hymns, and by Thursday we were lowering her into the ground. I'm sorry. She would have liked you, would have seen what I see, the strength that keeps you standing when most people would fall. The love that makes you risk everything for a child who isn't even your own." He closed the Bible carefully, reverently. "She always said that real courage wasn't the absence of fear, but doing what's right despite being afraid." Willa May settled beside him on the edge of the bed, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "Tell me about her." "Sarah Elizabeth Boone, born Sarah McKinnon in County Cork. Came west with her parents when she was 16. Met my father at a church social in Kansas City. They said she could charm birds from the trees and make a feast from nothing but flower and hope." Judah's voice grew soft with memory. "She had a garden out back where she grew. Everything beautiful roses and delphiniums and sweet peas that climbed the fence posts. Said a home wasn't complete without flowers to remind folks that not everything in the world was purely practical." "What happened to the garden?" "Died with her. Pa tried to keep it going for a while, but he didn't have the touch. After he passed, I just let it go to seed." Judah stared at the pressed flowers in the Bible, feeling the weight of neglect like a stone in his chest. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe I should have tried harder to preserve what she built. "It's never too late," Willa May said gently. "Gardens can be replanted. Beauty can be restored." The simple words carried layers of meaning that had nothing to do with flowers and everything to do with hope. Judah looked at her in the lamplight, seeing not just the woman who'd captured his heart, but the possibility of a future he'd never dared imagine. "When this is over," he said, "when Emma's safe and we've dealt with Nash and his kind, would you help me rebuild it? The garden, I mean. Make it the way she would have wanted." "I'd love that." Willa May's smile was radiant in the golden light. "We could plant roses for remembrance, lavender for devotion, maybe some of those sweet peas she loved so much. And vegetables too, tomatoes and beans and corn, a garden that feeds both body and soul. They sat together in comfortable silence, the Bible resting between them like a bridge connecting past and future. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the promise of rain and the scent of distant wildflowers. But their peace was shattered by the sound of gunshots from the direction of town. Judah was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his weapon. The shots came in rapid succession, not the random firing of celebration or practice, but the deliberate pattern of combat. Someone was in trouble. "Stay here," he told Willa May, but she was already reaching for her rifle. Like hell, if there's trouble in town, it affects all of us. They saddled horses quickly and rode toward Mercy Ridge through the gathering darkness, guided by the orange glow of flames that shouldn't have been there. As they crested the hill overlooking the town, the scope of the disaster became clear. The general store was burning. Martha Henley's shop, the same Martha who'd stood with them that morning, rifle in hand and courage in her heart, was being consumed by flames that reached toward the stars like grasping fingers. People ran back and forth with buckets, trying desperately to contain the blaze, but Judah could see it was too late. The building was lost. They found Tom Fletcher organizing the bucket brigade, his face streaked with soot and his eyes grim with rage. "What happened?" Judah demanded. Nash came back. Not him personally, but men working for him. Came in after dark, quiet-like. Set the fire, and were gone before anyone knew what was happening. Fletcher's voice was thick with fury. "But that's not the worst of it." "What else?" "They took Martha." The words hit Judah like a physical blow. Martha Henley was 70 years old, a widow who'd run the general store for 30 years and never hurt a soul in her life. The idea of men like Nash's associates getting their hands on someone so defenseless made his blood run cold. "Any witnesses?" Young Billy Crenshaw saw them loading someone into a wagon. "Couldn't tell for sure it was Martha in the dark, but she's the only one missing." Fletcher wiped soot from his eyes with the back of his hand. "They left this nailed to the door of the sheriff's office." He handed Judah a piece of paper, and even in the flickering firelight, the message was clear. "The debt still stands. Return the girl, or more will suffer. You have 48 hours. Below the typed words, someone had sketched a crude but unmistakable drawing of a noose. Willa May read over his shoulder, her face pale in the firelight. "They're going to kill her." "Not if I find them first." Judah's voice carried a deadly certainty that made several nearby townspeople look up from their bucket work. "Tom, I need you to organize watches on all the families who stood with us this morning. They'll try to pick us off one by one, use fear to turn the town against us." "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done this morning." Judah handed the threatening note back to Fletcher. "I'm going hunting." The fire burned itself out before dawn, leaving nothing but a blackened skeleton where Martha Henley's store had stood for 3 decades. In the grey, pre-dawn light, the destruction looked even worse, not just the loss of a building, but the death of something precious and irreplaceable. But as Judah prepared his weapons and planned his next move, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the war, the cold, focused rage of a righteous man pushed too far. Nash and his associates had made their first real mistake. They'd shown their true nature to a town that might have been willing to look the other way if they'd kept to the shadows. Now there was no middle ground, no room for compromise or negotiation. Now there was only war. The trail was easy enough to follow in the morning light. Nash's men had made no effort to hide their tracks, either from arrogance or because they wanted to be found. The wagon ruts led north toward the Badlands, where the prairie gave way to broken country full of ravines and hidden valleys, perfect territory for men who lived outside the law. Judah rode alone despite Willa May's protests. This was the kind of work he'd done before the homestead, before her, before hope had crept back into his life like sunrise after the longest night. It required a different kind of thinking, a colder calculation that he didn't want her to witness. The tracks led to an abandoned mining camp in a box canyon 20 miles from town. The silver had played out years ago, leaving behind a collection of ramshackle buildings that provided perfect shelter for anyone wanting to avoid civilization. Smoke rose from one of the larger structures, and horses were picketed in what had once been the mine's equipment yard. Judah left his own horse a half-mile away and approached on foot, using skills he'd learned in a dozen similar situations during his wandering years. The camp was poorly guarded. Nash's men were used to intimidating sheep, not dealing with wolves. A single sentry dozed in the morning sun, his rifle propped against a porch post while he caught up on lost sleep. From his concealed position in the rocks above the camp, Judah counted 6 men, including the sentry. Nash himself was nowhere to be seen, but his 2 companions from yesterday were there, along with 3 others who looked cut from the same cloth. All were armed, all looked competent enough to be dangerous, but none showed the heightened alertness of men expecting trouble. Martha Henley was tied to a chair inside what had once been the mining office, visible through a window that hadn't seen glass in years. Even from a distance, Judah could see she was alive and apparently unharmed, though her face showed the strain of her ordeal. The smart play would be to ride back to town, gather the other men, and return in force. But Martha didn't have time for smart plays. These men had demonstrated their willingness to murder innocents, and every hour she remained in their hands brought her closer to becoming another casualty in their war against decency. Judah checked his weapons one final time, then moved down from the rocks like a ghost, seeking vengeance. The sentry died without a sound, Judah's knife finding the space between his ribs with surgical precision. 1 down, 5 to go. He dragged the body behind a pile of mining equipment and took the man's position, the dead man's hat pulled low over his eyes. From this new vantage point, he could see the layout of the camp more clearly. 2 men sat on the porch of the largest building, playing cards and drinking from a bottle that made their movements slightly sluggish. 2 others were visible moving around inside, and the 5th was nowhere to be seen, probably sleeping off the previous night's celebration. Judah waited with the infinite patience of a predator until the card players got drunk enough to become careless. When one of them stumbled to the edge of the porch to relieve himself, Judah's bullet took him in the center of the chest. The man dropped without a cry, and his companion was still trying to process what had happened when the second shot ended, his confusion permanently. The sounds of gunfire brought the other 2 running from inside the building, but they emerged into bright sunlight from the darkness of the interior, momentarily blinded. Judah's rifle spoke twice more, and suddenly the camp was silent, except for the wind whistling through the abandoned structures. But silence could be deceptive. Judah waited, motionless as the rocks around him, until the 5th man made his mistake. He came creeping around the back of the building, trying to flank what he assumed was a position Judah no longer occupied. The man was competent enough to move quietly, smart enough to use cover, but not experienced enough to realize he was stalking a ghost. When he stepped into the open, confident he'd gained the advantage, Judah was already behind him. "Drop the gun," Judah said quietly. The man spun around, his weapon rising, and Judah's Colt roared one final time. 5 shots, 5 dead men, and Martha Henley was free to go home to what remained of her life. But as Judah cut her bonds and helped her to her feet, he realized the victory felt as hollow as the abandoned mine shafts that riddled the canyon walls. These men were foot soldiers, expendable assets in a larger game. Killing them might buy time, but it wouldn't end the threat. "Oh, Judah," Martha said, her voice shaking with relief and delayed terror. "I thought I was so afraid." "You're safe now," he assured her, though the words felt like lies in his mouth. None of them were safe, not really. Not while Nash and his masters remained free to recruit new killers and devise fresh atrocities. The ride back to town was conducted in grim silence, Martha clinging to the saddle horn while Judah's mind churned with dark possibilities. They'd escalated beyond mere intimidation now, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Nash would have to respond, and his response would be swift and brutal. They reached Mercy Ridge to find the town in a state of barely controlled panic. Word of Martha's kidnapping had spread quickly, and families were packing their belongings, preparing to flee rather than face whatever came next. The sight of her returning alive did little to calm their fears. If anything, it seemed to make things worse, as if her rescue guaranteed retaliation. Tom Fletcher met them at the edge of town, his face grim with news. "Nash came back while you were gone. Rode right down Main Street bold as brass, calling you out like some kind of gunfighter in a penny novel." "What did he say?" "Said you killed his men. Said the debt's doubled now, $1,000, or the girl, plus compensation for his losses. And if he doesn't get satisfaction, he'll burn the whole town and salt the ashes." Judah helped Martha down from the horse, noting how her hands trembled despite her attempts to appear strong. "He's bluffing. Men like Nash don't burn down town stew, much attention from territorial authorities, too much risk of federal involvement." "Maybe, but he's got more men now, counted at least a dozen when they rode through. Professional gun hands, by the look of them." Fletcher's expression was troubled. "Judah, I don't think we can win this. Not anymore. Maybe it's time to consider." "No." The word came out harder than Judah intended. "We don't negotiate with kidnappers and child traffickers. We don't pay tribute to men who torture old women for profit. And we sure as hell don't abandon Emma to monsters because the fight got harder." "Then what do we do?" Before Judah could answer, a small voice piped up from behind them. "Uncle Judah?" He spun around to find Emma Catherine Garrett standing in the shadow of the livery stable, clutching a child's wooden doll to her chest. She was exactly as Willa May had described, small for 8 years old, with intelligent brown eyes and dark hair that escaped from her braids in rebellious curls. But there were shadows under those eyes that spoke of too much fear in too short a life. "Emma." Judah knelt to her level, his voice gentle despite the fury still burning in his chest. "What are you doing here, sweetheart? You're supposed to be safe with the Hartmans. I heard the grown-ups talking. They said bad men were trying to hurt Aunt Willa because of me." Her lower lip trembled, but her voice remained steady. "I couldn't let that happen, so I came back." The simple courage of the statement hit Judah like a physical blow. This child, this brave, selfless little girl, was what Nash and his associates wanted to sell into slavery. The thought made him sick with rage and protective tenderness in equal measure. "Emma, listen to me," he said, taking her small hands in his larger ones. "Your Aunt Willa and we're going to keep you safe. But we need you to trust us, to do what we say, even when it's scary. Can you do that?" She nodded solemnly. "Are you really going to marry Aunt Willa?" The question caught him off guard, but he answered honestly, "Yes, I am. Would that be all right with you? Will that make you my papa?" The word hit him like a benediction, transforming something cold and tactical in his chest into warmth that spread through his entire being. "If you wanted to, yes, it would make me your papa." Emma smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and suddenly Judah understood why Willa May was willing to risk everything for this child. There was something luminous about her, something that spoke to the possibility of goodness surviving in a world that seemed determined to crush it. "I'd like that," she said simply. "Then it's settled." Judah stood and lifted her into his arms, marveling at how light she felt, how fragile and precious. "Now let's get you home to your Aunt Willa. She's been worried sick." As they walked toward the homestead, Emma's arms around his neck and her doll pressed between them, Judah felt something shift in his understanding of the fight ahead. It wasn't just about justice anymore, or even survival. It was about protecting the possibility of family, of love, enduring in the face of darkness. And for that, he would face down all the devils in hell. The telegram arrived 3 days later, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat from hard traveling. Tom Fletcher brought it to the homestead personally, his face grave with implications he didn't fully understand. "Came in on the territorial wire," he said, handing Judah the yellow paper with hands that shook slightly. "It's addressed to you, but I think it concerns all of us." Judah unfolded the telegram with growing unease. Official communications rarely brought good news, and the formal language of bureaucracy often concealed dangers that personal threats made explicit. "Judah, Boone, stop, Mercy Ridge. Stop, urgent. You bring Emma Garrett, Denver, immediately. Stop, girl, key witness, federal investigation. Stop, congressional committee testimony required. Stop, your cooperation essential. Stop, contact Marshal. Bradford, upon arrival, stop. Signed, Deputy Attorney General Morrison. He read it twice, then handed it to Willa May, who had emerged from the house with Emma close beside her. The little girl's presence had transformed the homestead in ways both subtle and profound, laundry fluttering on lines, the sound of laughter echoing from the kitchen, the simple miracle of a child's voice calling them to supper. "I don't understand," Willa May said, her voice tight with confusion and growing fear. "Emma's never been to Denver. She's never testified to anything. What investigation?" Judah's mind was racing. Pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicking into place. Emma's father, the man Wilhelm had claimed, died in a mining accident. Nash's certainty that she was worth far more than $500, the resources being brought to bear against a single child in a frontier town. "Emma," he said gently, kneeling beside the little girl, "I need you to think very carefully. Before you came to live with your Uncle Wilhelm and Aunt Willa, do you remember anything about your real father? Anything at all?" The child's face scrunched in concentration. He worked in a big building with lots of papers, and he was always writing things down, even at home. Mama said he was trying to catch bad men who stole money. Willa May's breath caught. "Emma, you told me your father died in a mining accident. That's what Uncle Wilhelm said to tell people. But Papa didn't work in mines. He wore a suit to work, and he had a badge like a sheriff, but different." Emma's young voice carried the confusion of a child trying to reconcile adult deceptions. "Before the bad men came, he told Mama that if anything happened to him, she should take me far away and never tell anyone who we really were." "What was your father's real name?" Judah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Thomas Garrett, but he said his work name was something else. Something with numbers and letters that I couldn't remember." Judah felt the world shift beneath his feet. Thomas Garrett, not a small-time gambler who'd died in a mining accident, but a federal investigator who'd stumbled onto something big enough to get him killed. Emma wasn't just a child caught in her uncle's debts. She was the daughter of a murdered federal agent, and potentially the only person who could identify his killers. The sound of approaching horses cut through his revelation like a blade. But these weren't Nash's men. Riders wore federal badges and carried themselves with the professional bearing of lawmen who'd learned their trade in places where competence meant survival. The leader was a tall man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much of what men did to each other when they thought no one was watching. He dismounted with the careful movements of someone who'd spent long hours in the saddle, and his hand rested casually on his gun butt. "I'm Marshal Bradford," he said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "I believe you received our telegram." "Just now," Judah replied, instinctively positioning himself between the marshal and Emma. "Mind explaining what this is about?" "It's about justice for a good man who died trying to do his job, and about preventing more good men from dying because the wrong people got their hands on information that could bring down half the territorial government." Bradford's gaze fixed on Emma with something between sympathy and determination. "Thomas Garrett was one of our best investigators. He'd uncovered a conspiracy that goes all the way to Washington territorial officials selling federal contracts, judges taking bribes to look the other way, congressmen protecting criminal enterprises in exchange for campaign contributions. And Emma was there the night they came for her father, hidden in a closet, scared out of her mind, but she saw their faces, heard their names. She's the only witness who can put the right men in prison and clean up this territory once and for all." Willa May stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. "She's 8 years old. She's been through enough trauma for 10 lifetimes. You can't seriously expect." "What I expect, ma'am, is to do my job, which is to protect federal witnesses and ensure that justice gets served." Bradford's voice softened slightly. "I understand your concerns. Hell, I've got children of my own, but if Emma doesn't testify, the men who killed her father go free, and more innocents die while criminals run this territory like their personal kingdom. What about Nash? Judah asked. What about the men who've been trying to kidnap her? Bradford's expression darkened. Nash works for Senator Morrison Ott, the Deputy Attorney General who signed that telegram. But his brother Harrison, who sits on the Territorial Development Committee. Nash was hired to either silence Emma permanently or deliver her to people who could make sure she never talked. When you folks started causing trouble, Morrison authorized whatever force was necessary to complete the mission. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Emma wasn't just being hunted by criminals, she was being pursued by men with badges and political power, men who could manipulate the law itself to serve their purposes. So what happens now? Willa May asked. Now you bring the girl to Denver. She testifies before the Congressional Committee, helps us identify the guilty parties, and then we relocate all of you somewhere safe. New identities, federal protection, a chance to start over where Morrison's people can't reach you. It was a reasonable, ophological, legal, and probably their best chance of survival. But something about it made Judah's soldier instincts prickle with unease. Federal protection was only as good as the men providing it, and corruption had a way of spreading through institutions like rot through timber. I need some time to think about this, he said. Time's a luxury we don't have, Bradford replied. Morrison's people know about the telegram. They'll be moving against you soon, probably tonight. Your only chance is to come with us now, while we can still guarantee your safety. Emma had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense concentration of a child trying to understand forces beyond her comprehension. Now she tugged on Judah's sleeve, her voice small but determined. I remember something else about that night, she said. One of the bad men, he had a star on his vest. Like yours, mister, she added, looking at Bradford. And he knew Papa's real name, the work name with numbers and letters. The marshal's face went very still. What else do you remember, sweetheart? He said Papa shouldn't have been so curious, said some secrets were worth more than one man's life. Emma's voice trembled, but she continued. And he said if Mama didn't keep quiet, there were lots of children who could use a new sister. Bradford exchanged glances with his men, and Judah saw something pass between them, recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of suspicions they'd already harbored. The corruption went deeper than even they had imagined, reaching into the very agencies tasked with fighting it. All right, Bradford said finally. Here's what we're going to do. We take Emma to Denver, but we do it my way. No official channels, no telegrams, no one knows our route or our destination, except the people in this conversation. And Mr. Boone? He looked directly at Judah. I meant what I said about federal protection. That includes you and Mrs. Garrett. You've made powerful enemies, and they won't forget. Judah looked at Willa May, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her worried eyes. They'd built something precious in the past, weak not just love, but the possibility of family, of belonging somewhere after years of wandering. Federal protection meant abandoning all of that, disappearing into new identities and starting over with nothing but each other. But the alternative was staying to fight a battle they couldn't win against enemies who had unlimited resources and no moral constraints. And Emma's safety had to come first, no matter what it cost them personally. When do we leave? He asked. Now, Bradford said. Gather what you can carry. Leave everything else. In 10 minutes, this place becomes too dangerous for anyone to call home. As they prepared to abandon the homestead, his father's land, his mother's garden, the dreams they'd barely begun to build, Judah felt the familiar weight of loss settling over his shoulders. He'd spent 15 years running from attachments, and now he understood why. Everything you loved could be taken away, and the deeper the love, the greater the pain of losing it. But as Emma slipped her small hand into his, trusting him to keep her safe no matter what it cost, Judah realized that some things were worth any sacrifice. Family wasn't just about blood or law or convenience. It was about choosing to protect each other when the whole world seemed determined to tear you apart. And for the first time since leaving for war 20 years ago, He was fighting for something that truly mattered. The journey to Denver took 3 days through country that grew more dangerous with each mile. Marshal Bradford proved to be a competent leader, choosing routes that avoided main roads and settlements where curious eyes might report their passage. But despite his precautions, Judah could feel pursuit closing behind them like a storm front gathering strength. On the second night, camped in a box canyon that offered good defensive positions, Bradford finally revealed the full scope of what they were facing. Thomas Garrett wasn't just investigating corruption, he said, poking at the campfire with a stick while Emma slept between Judah and Willa May. He'd uncovered something bigger, a network that spans from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., territorial contracts worth millions being awarded to shell companies, federal judges appointed based on their willingness to look the other way, even some army officers selling weapons to hostile tribes. "How deep does it go?" Judah asked. "Deep enough that when we started investigating, 3 of our own agents ended up dead. Deep enough that I can't trust my own superiors to keep Emma safe once she testifies." Bradford's weathered face looked older in the firelight. "That's why we're doing this off the books. The committee chairman is honest Senator Williams from Ohio, but even he doesn't know all the players on his own staff." Willa May shifted closer to Emma's sleeping form, maternal instincts heightened by the discussion of betrayal and murder. "What happens after she testifies? You said something about relocation, new identities. If she lives long enough to testify," Bradford's blunt words hit like physical blows. "Morrison's people know what she represents. They'll do anything to stop her from reaching that committee room, and they've got resources we can barely imagine. So what's the plan?" Bradford reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather case that clinked softly with the sound of metal on metal. Inside were 3 objects that caught the firelight, like fallen stars, military decorations from the war, including one that Judah recognized with a shock of surprise. "Medal of Honor," Bradford said, noting his reaction, "along with the Distinguished Service Cross and a Silver Star." Thomas Garrett wasn't just a federal investigator. He was Captain Thomas Garrett, Union Army, decorated for valor at Antietam and Gettysburg. He looked directly at Judah, just like Lieutenant Judah Boone, who received similar commendations for actions behind enemy lines. The words hit Judah like a physical blow. His military service was something he'd tried to forget, buried under years of drifting and the deliberate anonymity of frontier life. But apparently some secrets were harder to keep than others. "How did you—" "I make it my business to know who I'm working with, especially when that person demonstrates the kind of tactical thinking you showed dealing with Nash's men." Bradford's expression grew serious. "I need that experience, Judah. I need someone who understands warfare, who can think like a soldier when the situation calls for it." "What are you asking?" "I'm asking you to help me get Emma to that committee room alive. Not as a civilian trying to protect his family, but as the soldier you used to be." Bradford leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because tomorrow, when we reach Denver, we're going to war." That night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Judah found himself standing guard while the others rested. The medal lay heavy in his palm, a reminder of a younger man who'd believed in clear distinctions between right and wrong, who'd thought courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. The war had taught him otherwise. He'd seen good men die for bad causes, witnessed evil triumph through superior organization and resources. He'd learned that heroism was often indistinguishable from stupidity, and that the only honest response to victory was grief for what it had cost. But holding Emma's future in his hands, feeling the weight of Willa May's trust and love, Judah realized that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Not because victory was certain, but because defeat was unthinkable. "Can't sleep either?" He turned to find Willa May approaching, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the desert chill. In the starlight, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but there was steel in her spine that no amount of fear could bend. "Too much to think about," he admitted. "Tell me about the war, about what you did that earned you those medals." Judah was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. "I did what needed doing, Sometimes that meant killing men who probably had families waiting for them. Sometimes it meant watching friends die because I made the wrong tactical decision. Glory's just a word people use to make sense of senseless things. But you saved lives too. Made a difference. Maybe. Or maybe I just postponed the inevitable. He looked down at the medal, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. After the war, I couldn't settle down, couldn't find peace in normal life. Everything seemed meaningless compared to what we'd been through. So I kept moving, kept fighting other people's battles, because it was the only thing that felt real. Willa May moved closer, close enough that he could feel her warmth. And now? Now I've found something worth stopping for, worth building a life around. He looked at her directly, seeing love and understanding in her dark eyes. You and Emma, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. The belief that good things can still happen, even in a world full of Nashes and Morrisons. Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together, Judah interrupted. All of us, as a family. The word still felt strange on his tongue, but it carried a weight of truth that steadied him like an anchor in a storm. Family wasn't just about blood or legal documents, it was about choosing to stand together when everything tried to tear you apart. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the final stage of their journey. Denver sprawled before them like a promise and a threat, combined civilization and corruption, existing side by side, the future and the past, locked in eternal struggle. Bradford gathered them together for final instructions, his manner businesslike, but his eyes revealing the strain of the past 3 days. The hearings at 2 o'clock in the territorial courthouse will approach from the east, using back streets to avoid main thoroughfares. Once we're inside, Emma will be safe too many witnesses for Morrison's people to try anything overt. He looked directly at the little girl, his voice gentle despite the circumstances. You understand what you need to do, sweetheart. Emma nodded solemnly, clutching her wooden doll with hands that had grown steadier with each passing day. Tell the truth about what I saw that night, about the men who hurt Papa. That's right. And remember, these are good men asking the questions. They want to help you, want to make sure the bad men can't hurt anyone else. Will Aunt Willa and Uncle Judah be there with me? They'll be right outside the committee room, close enough to help if you need them, but far enough away to stay safe. As they prepared to enter the city, Judah felt the familiar pre-battle tension settle over him like a familiar coat. Every sense was heightened, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible warning of danger. Beside him, Willa May rode with the determined grace of a woman who'd found her courage in the crucible of crisis. But it was Emma who surprised him most. The frightened child who'd arrived at his homestead had transformed into something stronger still, young, still vulnerable, but possessed of a quiet dignity that spoke of reserves of strength she was only beginning to discover. Uncle Judah, she said as they entered the outskirts of Denver. Yes, sweetheart? After I tell the committee about Papa, after the bad men go to jail, we really get to go home, to the homestead and the garden we talked about. The question hit him like a physical blow. Home. Such a simple word for such a complex idea. The homestead represented everything he'd lost, and everything he hoped to build his parents' legacy, his own chance at redemption, the possibility of peace after decades of wandering. Yes, he said, the promise carrying all the weight of prayer. We'll go home. We'll plant that garden your Aunt Willa and I talked about, with roses for remembrance and vegetables to feed us through the winter. We'll fix the roof and mend the fences and make it the kind of place your Papa would have wanted you to grow up in. Emma smiled, the expression transforming her serious little face into something radiant. And we'll be a real family? We already are, Willa May said softly, reaching across to squeeze the child's hand. Papers and ceremonies don't make families. Love does, and we have plenty of that. The courthouse loomed ahead of them, its stone facade speaking of permanence and justice in equal measure. But as they approached through the maze of Denver's back streets, Judah noticed things that made his soldier instincts prickle with unease. Too many men lounging in doorways, too many eyes following their progress, too many hands resting casually near weapon grips. Bradford, he said quietly. "I see them," the marshal replied without turning his head. "We're expected." "How many?" "More than I like. But we're committed now. The hearing starts in 30 minutes, and Emma needs to be in that room." They dismounted at the courthouse's rear entrance, a service door that Bradford had arranged to have left unlocked. But as Judah helped Emma down from her horse, he caught sight of a familiar figure watching from across the street. Nash stood in the shadow of a building, no longer trying to hide his presence. His pale eyes fixed on Emma with the intensity of a predator watching prey, and his smile carried promises of violence that made Judah's blood run cold. "Change of plans," he said to Bradford. "They're not just watching, they're ready to move. This feels like a trap." "Maybe, but it's the only trap we've got." Bradford checked his weapons one final time, his movements betraying the tension he was trying to hide. "Emma's testimony is the only thing that can stop this corruption. Without it, Thomas Garrett died for nothing, and more good people will follow. And if we don't make it inside, then we make sure Emma does, whatever it costs us." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with the knowledge that some sacrifices were necessary, some prices worth paying. Judah looked at Willa May, seeing his own understanding reflected in her eyes. They'd found love in the midst of chaos, built something precious in the space between heartbeats. Now they had to be willing to die for it. "Ready?" Bradford asked. Judah took Emma's hand, feeling her small fingers curl trustingly around his. Willa May flanked her other side, and together they approached the courthouse door that might lead to justice or to their graves. Behind them, Nash's men began to move. The old iron bell from the homestead's bell tower had traveled with them to Denver, packed carefully in Willa May's saddlebags like a piece of home carried into uncertain territory. Bradford had questioned the extra weight, but Judah understood its significance. Some talismans were worth their burden, some symbols too powerful to abandon. Now, as Nash's men closed in around the courthouse, Judah wished he had that bell to ring as a warning, to call whatever allies might still exist in this corrupt city to stand with them against the darkness. The courthouse steps were crowded with the usual mixture of citizens and criminals that gravitated toward any center of legal power. But Judah's trained eye picked out the anomaliesmen who stood too straight, watched too carefully, carried themselves with the predatory stillness of professional killers. Morrison's resources were impressive, and his reach apparently limitless. "How many?" Bradford asked quietly as they approached the rear entrance. "Dozen, maybe more, positioned to cover all the exits." Judah's voice carried the calm precision of a man assessing battlefield conditions. "They're not trying to hide anymore. This is meant to be a public demonstration. Show the territory what happens to people who cross certain interests." Emma walked between them, her small hand clasped in Judah's larger one, her wooden doll tucked under her free arm. She'd grown quieter as they entered the city, as if sensing the weight of adult tensions settling around her like storm clouds. But her steps never faltered, and her chin remained raised with the stubborn dignity that had first drawn Judah to her cause. "I'm scared," she whispered as they reached the door. "That's all right, sweetheart," Willa May said, kneeling to the child's level. "Brave people get scared too. The difference is they do what's right, even when they're afraid. Like Papa did? Just like Papa did." Bradford tried the door handle and found it unlocked as promised. But as it swung open, revealing the dim interior corridor beyond, Judah felt every instinct he'd developed over 20 years of surviving dangerous situations, screaming warnings. "This is wrong," he said, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "Too easy, too convenient." "We don't have a choice," Bradford replied, but his own weapon was in his hand. "Now, the hearing starts in 15 minutes, and Emma needs to be in that room." They moved through the courthouse like ghosts, haunting familiar territory. The building was older than most in Denver, constructed of solid stone that spoke of permanence and justice. But the corridors felt empty in a way that went beyond mere absence of people. They felt abandoned, as if the very concept of law had fled this place. The committee room was on the third floor, accessible by a narrow staircase that would be easy to defend but equally easy to trap someone in. As they climbed, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space, Judah found himself thinking of other staircases, other climbs toward uncertain fates. The war had taught him that some ground was worth holding regardless of cost, and some heights were worth reaching even if you never came back down. At the second-floor landing, they encountered their first real opposition. 3 men waited in the corridor, not bothering to hide their intentions. They wore the kind of expensive suits that marked them as more than simple gunmen. These were Morrison's inner circle, men who combined political influence with a willingness to personally handle the violent work their positions required. "That's far enough," the leader said, his voice cultured but carrying an edge of absolute authority. "The child comes with us. The rest of you can walk away and pretend this never happened." "I don't think so," Judah replied calmly, positioning himself between the men and Emma. "Mr. Boone, isn't it? The famous war hero turned homesteader?" The man's smile was coldly amused. "Do you really think you can fight your way through an entire building full of armed men? Do you think your military training makes you invincible?" "No," Judah said honestly, "but I think you've made the same mistake a lot of men have made over the years. You think because you have more guns, more money, more political connections, that makes you better than the people you're trying to destroy. Doesn't it? Maybe. But there's one thing you don't have that we do. And what's that? Something worth dying for." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat, and then the world exploded into violence. Judah's first shot took the leader center mass, the heavy Colt roaring in the confined space like thunder. Bradford's gun spoke almost simultaneously, dropping the second man before he could clear leather. But the third gunman was faster than his companions, and his bullet took Bradford in the shoulder, spinning the marshal around and sending him crashing into the wall. Willa May's derringer barked twice, the small weapon loud as a cannon in the narrow corridor. Her shots went wide, but they forced the remaining gunman to dive for cover, giving Judah the second he needed to line up his next shot. When the echoes faded, 3 men lay dead in the courthouse corridor, and the smell of gunpowder hung in the air like incense at a funeral for innocence. "Bradford?" Judah called. "Alive," the marshal gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Bullet went through. I can still fight." But even as he spoke, the sound of running feet echoed from both ends of the corridor. More men were coming, too many to fight in this confined space with Emma to protect and Bradford wounded. "The committee room," Judah said. "We get Emma to the committee room and make our stand there." They climbed the final flight of stairs with desperate urgency, Emma's legs pumping to keep up despite her exhaustion and fear. Behind them, voices shouted orders and threats in equal measure. Ahead lay the promise of justice if they could reach it alive. The committee room door stood open, revealing a chamber that looked like something from a different world. Polished wood panels reflected lamplight, creating an atmosphere of dignity and deliberation that seemed impossible given the violence raging just outside. 3 men in formal attire sat behind a curved desk, their faces grave with the knowledge of what was at stake. "Senator Williams," Bradford gasped as they stumbled into the room. "Marshal Bradford, we've been expecting you." The chairman was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough of politics to value truth when it appeared. "Is this the child?" "Emma Garrett," Bradford confirmed, "daughter of Agent Thomas Garrett, witness to his murder." "And those gunshots we heard?" "Morrison's people. They're trying to stop her from testifying." Senator Williams stood, his expression hardening into something that suggested he hadn't survived 3 decades in politics by being weak when strength was required. "Then we'd better get her testimony recorded before they try again." But even as he spoke, the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside grew louder, more organized. Nash's voice could be heard giving orders, positioning men to cover every possible escape route. "They're surrounding the building," Judah said, moving to the window and peering down at the street below. "More men outside than we saw before. This isn't just about stopping Emma anymore. They're planning to kill everyone who's heard her story." Emma tugged on his sleeve, her young face serious with the weight of adult understanding. "Uncle Judah, if I tell what I saw, will it really stop the bad men?" He knelt beside her, seeing courage in her eyes that humbled him. "Yes, sweetheart, it will stop them. But you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who'd made peace with necessity. "Papa died trying to stop them. I can't let that be for nothing." The door to the committee room slammed shut as Nash's men reached the corridor outside. But Emma Catherine Garrett, 8 years old and braver than most adults would ever be, walked calmly to the witness chair and began to speak the truth that would either save them all or see them die together in the name of justice. The widow's shotgun had belonged to Wilhelm Garrett, but it had become something more in Willa May's handsaw, symbol of transformation from victim to warrior, from the woman who'd wept on the homestead steps to the one who now stood between evil and innocence with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. Emma's voice filled the committee room with the clear, unwavering testimony of a child who'd seen too much but refused to let fear silence the truth. She told them about the night her father died, about the men who'd come in darkness, about the badges they wore and the names they'd used when they thought no one was listening. "The man with the pale eyes," he called the other one, "Senator Morrison," she said, her small voice carrying across the room with the weight of absolute certainty. "And Senator Morrison said Papa shouldn't have been so curious about the railroad contracts." Senator Williams leaned forward, his face grave with the implications of her words. "Emma, are you certain that's what you heard? Senator Morrison specifically?" "Yes, sir. And he said there were judges who owed him favors and marshals who knew better than to ask questions about missing people." The committee stenographer's fingers flew across his recording machine, capturing every word of testimony that would either bring down a corrupt network or die with them in this room. Outside, Nash's men had begun testing the door, their voices growing more urgent as they realized what was happening inside. Bradford, his wounded shoulder bound with strips torn from Willa May's petticoat, positioned himself at the room's main window with his rifle ready. "They're bringing up something heavy," he reported. "Looks like they plan to break down the door." "How long do we have?" Judah asked. "Minutes, maybe less." Judah looked around the room, taking inventory of their defensive positions and resources. 3 windows, 1 door, 5 adults and 1 child against at least a dozen armed men who were willing to commit mass murder to keep their secrets safe. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. But mathematics didn't account for the human spirit, for the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. And mathematics certainly didn't account for love strong enough to transform ordinary people into something approaching heroes. "Senator," Judah said, "how much more do you need from Emma?" "Every detail she can remember. Names, dates, specific conversations. This testimony is the key to bringing down the entire network, but only if it's complete. Then she keeps talking, and we keep them out." Judah checked his weapons one final time, the familiar ritual steadying his nerves. "Willa May, I need you at the side window with that shotgun." "Bradford, you take the door. I'll cover the main window." Emma continued her testimony, even as the sounds of violence grew closer, her young voice a thread of innocence running through the gathering darkness. She told them about documents her father had hidden, about meetings in hotel rooms where maps were spread and money changed hands, about the systematic corruption that had turned the territorial government into a criminal enterprise. The door shuddered under the impact of something heavier battering ram, probably, or maybe just men with sledgehammers and the desperation that comes from knowing failure meant exposure and ruin. Wood splintered around the hinges, and Judah could hear Nash shouting orders on the other side. "They're coming up the fire escape," Willa May called from her position at the side window. "How many?" 3, maybe 4, armed with rifles. The glass exploded inward as gunfire erupted from the fire escape, bullets chewing splinters from the wooden panels behind the committee desk. Senator Williams and his colleagues dove for cover, But the stenographer kept working, his machine clicking steadily as Emma's testimony continued, despite the chaos surrounding them. Willa May's shotgun roared, the heavy charge of buckshot sweeping the fire escape clean of attackers. But more were coming up behind them, and the door was beginning to give way under the sustained assault. "Emma," Senator Williams called from behind his overturned desk, "tell us about the railroad contracts. What did your father discover?" "He found papers that showed the contracts going to companies that didn't exist," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the gunfire around her. "And the money for building the railroads was being sent to banks in San Francisco, but no railroads were being built. It was brilliant in its simplicity, federal money allocated for territorial development, but diverted into private accounts, while the infrastructure projects remained nothing but lines on fraudulent maps. Millions of dollars stolen from a nation trying to rebuild after war, with the blessing of officials who were supposed to be servants of the people." The door finally gave way with a crash that seemed to shake the entire building. Nash appeared in the opening like something from a nightmare, his pale eyes blazing with fury and his gun already firing. His bullet took a chunk out of the wall inches from Judah's head, close enough that he could feel the heat of its passing. Judah's return shot was more accurate, catching Nash in the chest and spinning him around. But the man was tough as rawhide, and twice as mean. He stayed on his feet and kept shooting, his bullets forcing everyone in the room to stay low while his men poured through the broken doorway behind him. "The witness list," Emma said, still speaking to the committee even as violence raged around her. "Papa had a list of people who were going to testify against the bad men, but they all died before they could talk to anyone." Bradford's rifle cracked from his position by the window, and one of Nash's men crumpled to the floor. But return fire from the corridor caught the marshal in the leg, and he went down hard, blood spreading across the polished wooden floor. Willa May moved from her window position, the widow's shotgun in her hands like an instrument of divine justice. She'd lost one husband to violence and poverty, watched helplessly as the world tried to break her spirit. But she wouldn't lose this family. Not Emma, not Judah, not the future they'd built from hope and determination. Nash saw her coming and turned his gun in her direction, his pale eyes fixed on her face with murderous intent. But Willa May had been preparing for this moment since the first day she'd held a weapon, and her shot was perfect. The heavy charge of buckshot took Nash center mass, lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing backward into the corridor. His pale eyes went wide with surprise, then clouded with the realization that his long career of violence and intimidation was finally over. With their leader dead, Nash's remaining men seemed to lose their coordination. Some fled down the corridor, unwilling to die for causes they didn't fully understand. Others pressed forward, driven by desperation or loyalty to paymasters who wouldn't protect them if they failed. But the tide had turned. Emma's testimony was complete and recorded, the truth finally spoken in a place where it could do some good. And the people who'd fought to protect that truth had proven that courage and love could triumph over corruption and violence, even when the odds seemed impossible. The widow's shotgun had belonged to Wilhelm Garrett, but it had become something more in Willa May's Hansar, symbol of transformation from victim to warrior, from the woman who'd wept on the homestead steps to the one who now stood between evil and innocence, with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. Emma's voice filled the committee room with the clear, unwavering testimony of a child who'd seen too much but refused to let fear silence the truth. She told them about the night her father died, about the men who'd come in darkness, about the badges they wore, and the names they'd used when they thought no one was listening. The man with the pale eyes, he called the other one, Senator Morrison, she said, her small voice carrying across the room with the weight of absolute certainty. And Senator Morrison said Papa shouldn't have been so curious about the railroad contracts. Senator Williams leaned forward, his face grave with the implications of her words. "Emma, are you certain that's what you heard? Senator Morrison specifically?" "Yes, sir. And he said there were judges who owed him favors and marshals who knew better than to ask questions about missing people." The committee stenographer's fingers flew across his recording machine, capturing every word of testimony that would either bring down a corrupt network or die with them in this room. Outside, Nash's men had begun testing the door, their voices growing more urgent as they realized what was happening inside. Bradford, his wounded shoulder bound with strips torn from Willa May's petticoat, positioned himself at the room's main window with his rifle ready. "They're bringing up something heavy," he reported. "Looks like they plan to break down the door." "How long do we have?" Judah asked. "Minutes, maybe less." Judah looked around the room, taking inventory of their defensive positions and resources. 3 windows, 1 door, 5 adults and 1 child against at least a dozen armed men who were willing to commit mass murder to keep their secrets safe. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. But mathematics didn't account for the human spirit, for the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. And mathematics certainly didn't account for love strong enough to transform ordinary people into something approaching heroes. "Senator," Judah said, "how much more do you need from Emma?" "Every detail she can remember. Names, dates, specific conversations. This testimony is the key to bringing down the entire network, but only if it's complete. Then she keeps talking, and we keep them out." Judah checked his weapons one final time, the familiar ritual steadying his nerves. "Willa May, I need you at the side window with that shotgun. Bradford, you take the door. I'll cover the main window." Emma continued her testimony, even as the sounds of violence grew closer, her young voice a thread of innocence running through the gathering darkness. She told them about documents her father had hidden, about meetings in hotel rooms where maps were spread and money changed hands, about the systematic corruption that had turned the territorial government into a criminal enterprise. The door shuddered under the impact of something heavy, a battering ram, probably, or maybe just men with sledgehammers, and the desperation that comes from knowing failure meant exposure and ruin. Wood splintered around the hinges, and Judah could hear Nash shouting orders on the other side. "They're coming up the fire escape," Willa May called from her position at the side window. "How many?" 3, maybe 4, armed with rifles. The glass exploded inward as gunfire erupted from the fire escape, bullets chewing splinters from the wooden panels behind the committee desk. Senator Williams and his colleagues dove for cover, but the stenographer kept working, his machine clicking steadily as Emma's testimony continued, despite the chaos surrounding them. Willa May's shotgun roared, the heavy charge of buckshot sweeping the fire escape clean of attackers. But more were coming up behind them, and the door was beginning to give way under the sustained assault. "Emma," Senator Williams called from behind his overturned desk, "tell us about the railroad contracts. What did your father discover?" "He found papers that showed the contracts going to companies that didn't exist," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the gunfire around her. "And the money for building the railroads was being sent to banks in San Francisco, but no railroads were being built. It was brilliant in its simplicity, federal money allocated for territorial development, but diverted into private accounts, while the infrastructure projects remained nothing but lines on fraudulent maps. Millions of dollars stolen from a nation trying to rebuild after war, with the blessing of officials who were supposed to be servants of the people." The door finally gave way with a crash that seemed to shake the entire building. Nash appeared in the opening like something from a nightmare, his pale eyes blazing with fury and his gun already firing. His bullet took a chunk out of the wall inches from Judah's head, close enough that he could feel the heat of its passing. Judah's return shot was more accurate, catching Nash in the chest and spinning him around. But the man was tough as rawhide, and twice as mean. He stayed on his feet and kept shooting, his bullets forcing everyone in the room to stay low while his men poured through the broken doorway behind him. "The witness list," Emma said, still speaking to the committee even as violence raged around her. "Papa had a list of people who were going to testify against the bad men. But they all died before they could talk to anyone." Bradford's rifle cracked from his position by the window, and one of Nash's men crumpled to the floor. But return fire from the corridor caught the marshal in the leg, and he went down hard, blood spreading across the polished wooden floor. Willa May moved from her window position, the widow's shotgun in her hands, like an instrument of divine justice. She'd lost one husband to violence and poverty, watched helplessly as the world tried to break her spirit. But she wouldn't lose this family. Not Emma, not Judah, not the future they'd built from hope and determination. Nash saw her coming and turned his gun in her direction, his pale eyes fixed on her face with murderous intent. But Willa May had been preparing for this moment since the first day she'd held a weapon, and her shot was perfect. The heavy charge of buckshot took Nash center mass, lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing backward into the corridor. His pale eyes went wide with surprise, then clouded with the realization that his long career of violence and intimidation was finally over. With their leader dead, Nash's remaining men seemed to lose their coordination. Some fled down the corridor, unwilling to die for causes they didn't fully understand. Others pressed forward, driven by desperation or loyalty to paymasters who wouldn't protect them if they failed. But the tide had turned. Emma's testimony was complete and recorded, the truth finally spoken in a place where it could do some good. And the people who'd fought to protect that truth had proven that courage and love could triumph over corruption and violence, even when the odds seemed impossible. The gunfire gradually faded as the last of Nash's men either fled or fell. In the sudden silence, Emma's voice could be heard clearly for the first time in minutes, still answering Senator Williams' questions with the patient determination of a child who understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. "Is there anything else you remember, Emma?" the senator asked gently. "Any other names or places that might help us find the rest of the people involved?" Emma nodded solemnly, clutching her wooden doll as she spoke the final words that would bring justice for her father and safety for her new family. "Papa said the man in charge lived in a big house in San Francisco, and his name was Governor Henley. He said Governor Henley was the one who decided which people lived and which people died." The stenographer's machine clicked one final time, recording the testimony that would topple a criminal empire and restore some measure of justice to a territory that had been poisoned by corruption. Outside, the sound of federal reinforcements could be heard securing the building, arriving too late for the battle, but just in time to clean up the aftermath. Senator Williams stood slowly, his formal clothes rumpled, but his dignity intact. "Miss Garrett, you are the bravest young lady I have ever had the honor to meet. Your father would be very proud of you." Emma smiled then, the expression transforming her serious little face into something radiant with hope. "Can we go home now, Uncle Judah? Can we plant that garden?" Judah looked at Willa May, seeing his own exhausted joy reflected in her eyes. They'd survived the impossible, protected what mattered most, and earned the right to build something beautiful from the ashes of everything they'd lost. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, lifting Emma into his arms while Willa May pressed close against his side. "We can go home." The new wedding ring that Judah crafted from his father's silver caught the morning light like a promise made manifest, its simple band reflecting both the sunrise and the hope that had carried them through the darkest valley of their lives. He'd worked on it during the long evenings of Emma's recovery, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they shaped the precious metal into something that would symbolize not just marriage, but the triumph of love over fear, of family over loneliness. 3 months had passed since the Denver courthouse, 3 months of testimony and trials, of corrupt officials being led away in chains, while good men stepped forward to fill the void they'd left behind. Senator Morrison was awaiting execution in a federal prison. Governor Henley had fled to Mexico with what remained of his stolen wealth, and the territorial government was slowly, carefully being rebuilt with oversight from Washington. Emma's nightmares had faded with time, and the patient love of people who understood that healing sometimes took longer than the wounds that required it. She'd grown taller in those months, stronger, her laughter more frequent, and her smiles less shadowed by memories of violence and loss. The wooden doll her father had given her still accompanied her everywhere, but now it was a companion in play rather than a talisman against terror. The homestead had been transformed as well. What they'd fled in desperate haste had become a place of peace and plenty under Willa May's gentle guidance and Judah's steady labor. The roof was whole again, the fences mended, the barn filled with livestock purchased with the reward money the federal government had paid for information, leading to the conviction of the corruption network. But it was the garden that spoke most eloquently of their transformation, from survivors to a family building something lasting. Where weeds had once grown wild, rows of vegetables now stretched toward the horizon, corn and beans and squash planted in the traditional manner, tomatoes heavy on their vines, herbs that filled the air with their fragrance. And everywhere among the practical plants, flowers bloomed in glorious profusion, roses for remembrance, lavender for devotion, sweet peas climbing the fence posts, just as Sarah Boone had grown them 40 years before. Emma knelt among the flowers now, her small hands gentle as she gathered blooms for the wedding bouquet. She'd insisted on helping with every aspect of the ceremony, from choosing the hymns to decorating the little church in town where they would speak their vows. Her enthusiasm had been infectious, drawing the whole community into the celebration of something that felt like a victory not just for the bride and groom, but for the very idea that good things could still happen in a world that often seemed determined to crush hope. "Uncle Judah," she called, her voice bright with excitement. "Are you ready to marry Aunt Willa?" He looked up from where he was adjusting his collar, his father's best shirt, carefully preserved and altered to fit his broader shoulders. "More ready than I've ever been for anything, sweetheart." "Even more ready than when you went to war?" The question was innocent, but it carried weight that made Judah pause in his preparations. The war had been about duty and country and abstract concepts of right and wrong. This was about something far more personal and infinitely more precious: the choice to build rather than destroy, to stay rather than wander, to love rather than merely survive. "Much more ready," he said honestly. "The war was something I had to do. This is something I want to do." Emma nodded, as if this made perfect sense, then returned to her flower gathering with the serious concentration of a child entrusted with an important task. Watching her, Judah felt the familiar miracle of gratitude wash over him, not just for her safety, but for the way she'd transformed their lives simply by existing, by needing protection, by believing that adults could be trusted to keep their promises. From the house came the sound of women's voices, Willa May and Martha Henley, who'd become an unlikely but devoted friend, putting the finishing touches on the wedding dress that had been sewn from fabric ordered specially from St. Louis. It was simple but elegant, cream-colored silk with pearl buttons and lace at the collar, the kind of dress a woman might wear to start a new life with a man who'd proven himself worthy of her trust. Tom Fletcher appeared around the corner of the house, leading 2 horses decorated with ribbons and wildflowers. He'd volunteered to serve as Judah's best man, claiming it was the least he could do for the man who'd helped save their town from corruption and violence. But Judah suspected the older man simply understood the importance of witnessing moments when good things happened to people who deserved them. "Horses are ready," Fletcher announced. "Church is ready. Half the county's ready. Only question now is whether the groom's ready." "He's been ready for weeks," Emma piped up from her position among the flowers. "He keeps looking at Aunt Willa like she might disappear if he blinks too hard." The observation was uncomfortably accurate, and Judah felt heat rise in his cheeks. But it was true. After a lifetime of losing things he cared about, he sometimes found it hard to believe that happiness could be permanent, that love could be trusted to endure. Willa May appeared in the doorway then, and all such doubts vanished like mist before the sun. She was beautiful in the way that transcended mere physical appearance, beautiful in her strength, her courage, her capacity to love a broken-down soldier and a traumatized child with equal devotion. The wedding dress transformed her into something radiant, but it was the joy in her eyes that took his breath away. "Well," she asked, smoothing the silk with nervous hands, "will I do?" "You'll more than do," Judah said, his voice rough with emotion. "You'll be perfect." The ride to town was a procession of happiness, with Emma on her own pony between them, chattering excitedly about everything and nothing, while Judah and Willa May exchanged glances that spoke of shared anticipation and quiet wonder. The countryside rolled past in all its autumn glory, golden grass bending in the breeze, cottonwoods dressed in yellow and orange, the sky so blue it seemed to go on forever. The church was packed with people who'd come not just to witness a wedding, but to celebrate the triumph of everything decent and hopeful in their small corner of the world. Doc Harrison was there, along with Jake Morrison and most of the other townspeople who'd stood with them during the darkest days. Even Marshal Bradford had made the journey from Denver, his arm still in a sling, but his presence a reminder that justice sometimes did prevail. Pastor Mackenzie, who'd known Judah's family since before the war, performed the ceremony with the quiet dignity that had made him beloved by 3 generations of frontier families. His words about love and commitment, about choosing to build something lasting in a world of temporary things, seemed to carry special weight in the context of everything they'd all survived together. "Do you, Judah Thomas Boone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in good times and bad, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," Judah said, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "And do you, Willa May Garrett, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in good times and bad, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," she replied, her voice clear and strong. When Judah slipped the silver ring onto her finger, it seemed to catch fire in the light streaming through the church windows, becoming a circle of brightness that spoke of promises kept and futures earned through sacrifice and courage. And when they kissed to seal their union, Emma's delighted applause from the front pew was echoed by every person in the building. The reception was held in the churchyard, with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by every family in the county. There was dancing to fiddle music, toasts with apple cider, and the kind of uncomplicated joy that comes from celebrating something purely good in the company of people who understand its value. As the sun set and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Judah found himself standing apart from the celebration, just watching, memorizing the sight of Willa May laughing with Martha Henley, of Emma teaching the younger children how to dance, of an entire community gathered in happiness around the family he'd never expected to have. "Regrets?" Tom Fletcher asked, joining him in his quiet observation. "None," Judah replied honestly. "For the first time in my life, no regrets at all." "Good, because that little girl of yours is already making plans for the future. Heard her telling some of the other children about the school she wants to start, the books she's going to read, the places she wants to see when she's grown." Judah smiled, thinking of all the dreams Emma would have time to pursue, all the possibilities that stretched before her like an endless prairie waiting to be explored. She's got time for all of it now. Time to be a child, time to grow up safe, time to become whatever she wants to become. "And you? What do you want to become?" The question was simple, but the answer required consideration. For most of his adult life, Judah had defined himself by what he was leaving behind rather than what he was moving toward. He'd been a soldier, then a drifter, then a protector, always defined by circumstance rather than choice. But now, watching his wife and daughter celebrate the beginning of their new life together, he knew exactly what he wanted to become. "A father," he said quietly. "A husband, a man who plants gardens instead of graves, who builds things that last, who stays long enough to watch them grow." Fletcher nodded approvingly. "Your parents would be proud. They built something good here, and you're carrying it forward." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma appeared at Judah's side, her dress slightly rumpled from dancing but her eyes bright with happiness. "Papa," she said, testing the word that had become natural over the past months. "Are you ready to go home?" Home. Such a simple word for such a complex miracle. The homestead wasn't just a place, no, it was a promise made manifest, a dream built from love and determination, and the refusal to let evil triumph over good. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, lifting her into his arms while Willa May joined them, still radiant in her wedding dress. "We're ready to go home." The ride back to the homestead was conducted in comfortable silence. The three of them lost in their own thoughts as the stars wheeled overhead and the prairie stretched endlessly around them. But when they crested the hill that gave the first clear view of their valley, Emma's excited voice broke the quiet. "Look, the lights are still on." She was right. Every window in the house glowed with warm lamplight, and lanterns hung from the porch posts like fallen stars. It was Martha's doing. Judah realized the older woman had insisted on preparing their homecoming, transforming their simple house into something that looked like a fairy tale illustration of home and happiness. As they approached the front porch where this story had begun, Judah remembered the evening when he'd first seen Willa May crying on his steps, the moment when words he'd never expected to speak had changed everything. The woman weeping in desperation had become his wife, the frightened child had become his daughter, and the lonely drifter had become a man with roots deep enough to weather any storm. "When I saw you crying on my stairs," he said softly, the words carrying all the weight of prophecy fulfilled, "I knew I was going to marry you." Willa May smiled, the expression radiant in the lamplight, "And I knew you were either crazy or the answer to prayers I was afraid to pray." "Which was it?" "Both," she said, standing on tiptoe to kiss him, while Emma giggled at their obvious affection. "Definitely both." As they walked through the door of their home, their real home, built on love and defended with courage, Judah felt the last of his old restlessness settle into peace. The wandering was over, the searching complete. He'd found what he'd spent a lifetime looking for, without knowing he was looking. He'd found family, he'd found home, he'd found love strong enough to transform two broken souls and one frightened child into something that could face any future together. And tomorrow, they'd wake up and start building that future, one day at a time, in the garden they'd planted where his mother's flowers once grew.